I work at Hope, if you don't know that already. I do. I am here to talk about Deliverance, not the movie. Thanks, Raj, for pointing that out. Nobody knows the movie Deliverance, really? I got one nod. It's not, don't worry about it. So there's three big things that I want to talk about in regards to deliverance. The first thing is that I think we need to define it before we can really talk about it. The second thing I want to talk about are specific acts of deliverance. And then the third thing that I want to talk about is the goal of deliverance. So the first thing I want to talk about is the definition of deliverance. Maybe. So there are at least 35 different words that are translated as deliverer, deliverance, delivering, etc. in the Old Testament. Of those 35 different words, there are four kind of big overarching meanings, and so I want to talk about each of those four meanings. So the first one is to deliver over or to deliver into the hands of. That word is natan or sagar. I don't know if you are people that like those words, but there they are. It also could mean to deliver over into the power of another person. Slow down, man. Sometimes it's in regards to things such as books or money or horses, non-people objects. More often in the Old Testament, it refers to people being delivered over into the hands of their enemies. So sometimes, such as in the story of David and Goliath, hey, good job, buddy. Sometimes it is people being delivered over to the power of their enemies. So in the story of David and Goliath, David says to Goliath that God will deliver Goliath into God's hand, and so into David's hand. So this is the word that he used there. So this meeting often involves God bringing Israel into confrontation with their enemies so that their enemies are defeated. But it can also involve God bringing Israel into battle so that Israel can be defeated, and that's sometimes as a consequence of their sin or rebellion. The second word that I want to look at means to deliver out of the hands of or to escape. So this is the word netzal, go. I'm looking at you. I will no longer look at Ben unless I want him to progress the PowerPoint. All right. That word is netzal or malat, means to deliver out of the hands of or to escape from. So this meaning illustrates God's rescue of his people from the dominion of Satan and the world system at the time. So in Exodus, God rescues the Israelites from Egypt. Gosh, we tried everything to try to make me not distracted, and here we are. So sorry. If I just had the clicker, this would be all better. So in the Exodus, I'm assuming everybody knows this story, the Israelites are delivered from the hand of Egypt. So the word there in delivered means that God delivered them out of the hands of a powerful world system. The third definition of deliverance would be drawing someone to oneself. Oh, I couldn't find a better picture, so I got Mortal Kombat. Scorpion, ha! He grabs the guy and then pulls the guy towards him, for those of you that aren't Mortal Kombat fans. So this meaning often shows that God's motive behind deliverance is his fervent desire of fellowship with his people. So it's not just so that God delivers the people out of Egypt, it's so that he delivers them out of Egypt and brings them to himself. So then the fourth definition here is to have ample space between oneself and one's enemies. Lord of the Rings and Mortal Kombat seem like good back to back here. He's really not out of the hands, they're coming towards him, but you get the idea. Have ample space between one and one's enemies. So the end result there is the process of deliverance where the enemies are beaten back and brought into subjection so that they can no longer press in or harass or endanger the people or their land. So Israelites' enemies are pushed away so far that they are no longer a threat to them. So all of these definitions fall within the field of meaning describing God's redemptive activity on the part of his people. Really the acts of God where he delivers people. So when we take into account all four of those big overarching meanings, now granted there are still those 35 words out there that are all kind of the same thing, but I'm making my own rough definition of deliverance here, which is to be removed by God from the hand of the enemy and drawn close to himself, from which position God places us in confrontation with the enemy on God's own terms in order for us to gain victory and defeat the enemy and to experience freedom from oppression in an ample and secure place. So I know that's a mouthful. Whoa, buddy. I did. That's a true statement. I know that's a mouthful. It's a very long definition. Here's the gist. Israel is fighting with an enemy. There's some kind of conflict. God brings them away from their enemy, draws him to himself, and then will put them often back in conflict with that enemy or with another enemy so that they can win on God's terms or be defeated on God's terms with the intent that the people will be brought to himself. Does that make sense? And that's a long definition. Well, you can look at it later if you're not caught up. So the second thing that I want to look at is acts of deliverance. Nailed it. In the Old Testament, God's deliverance is almost always from temporal dangers. Anyone? I really like this. Come on, no chuckles. Thanks for the pity laugh, guys. So God almost always delivers the people in the Old Testament from temporal things that aren't big picture. They're very like right here, right now, we really need help. So these big things are he rescues people from their enemies. He rescues them from the hands of the wicked. He preserves them from famine, from starvation. He preserves them from death and the grave. And he, though this is mentioned infrequently, it's still, the concept is still there in the Old Testament that he delivers his people from sin and its consequences. So when you look at all of those things, enemies, the wicked, famine, death and the grave, sin, we see that God delivers his people from humankind's fears, from the things that men are afraid of. The other thing that I want to look at in regards to the acts of God's deliverance is the fact that God delivers as he does as a polemic against the pagan rulers who challenge his ability to save his people. So he does it in the way that he does so that the other nations can see who he is. In Daniel 3, we see the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm assuming you know the end of the story, right, where they walk out and they're like, haha, we're fine. And everyone's like, what? But I was really struck by the beginning of the story, which I've never really paid much attention to, where King Nebuchadnezzar creates images and idols and says, everybody needs to worship these. And these three dudes are like, nope. And he's like, well, I'm going to throw you in a burning fiery furnace then. And they're like, okay. No, that's not really what they said. Their response was really convicting for me. They said, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand. But if not, be it known to you that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And I think that's really cool because they're saying, we know that God can rescue us, but if he doesn't, we're still not going to do what you're asking us to do because you're asking us to go against him. I love that story. Another way that we see God's deliverance as a polemic against other rulers is in Exodus. I'm trying real hard to not let this bug me. When Moses asks Pharaoh to let his people go, and Pharaoh's like, nobody has the ability to let you people go, and because you asked me, I'm going to make you work even harder. And then lo and behold, God, he lets the people go. There's another story in 2 Chronicles that I really like. King Sennacherib sends his men into Judah to tell them this story. In what do you trust, that you remain under siege in Jerusalem? So he's saying, like, what is it that your hope is in, that you're in Jerusalem getting fought all the time? Does not Hezekiah, who was the king of Judah at the time, persuade you to give yourselves over to die by famine and thirst, saying, the Lord our God will deliver us from the hand of the king of Assyria? Do you not know that I and my fathers have done to all the peoples of all the other lands? Were the gods of the nations of those lands in any way able to deliver their lands out of my hand? And he goes on and on about, this is where I come from. Assyria is so big, you cannot defeat us. And you're going to stay in Jerusalem for what? To die? To starve to death? You idiots. 2 sentences later, Israel is redeemed, delivered, and this dude kills himself because I'm pretty sure he was just embarrassed about it. So all of these rulers, Pharaoh, king of Assyria, who was the first one I said? Oh, Nebuchadnezzar. They just rail against Israel for trusting that God can deliver them. And the subsequent rescue that God provides serves as a demonstration of his ability to deliver his people, even from the most powerful worldly forces. And he does that not just for his people, but also so that those nations can see that he is who he says he is. So the next thing that I want to talk about in regards to acts of deliverance is that God is the great deliverer. I couldn't find a picture of God, so this is what I got. You're welcome. So because God is the great deliverer, there are no manipulative ploys on the part of his people to make him deliver them. His deliverance are totally his initiative and express his mercy and his love for his people. Oh, go back. Sorry, sometimes I look at the computer, it's confusing. I'll do this. Totally God's initiative and express his mercy and his love for his people. The second thing is that they are for God's people, those who trust and fear in him. The third thing is that they often include, see, then I get distracted. They often include the people's fear of God and trust in him. So while it's not the people's fear of God or trust in him that makes him deliver them, we often see that pattern happening before acts of deliverance. And then the fourth thing is that sometimes his acts of deliverance are a consequence of people's sin and rebellion. But like I said earlier, that's always with the intent of bringing them back to himself. So the last thing I want to talk about in regards to acts of deliverance are the means that God uses to do that. I got a lot of these, so giddy up, people. I'm assuming you've read enough of the Old Testament that some of these stories will hit home with you. If you haven't, they don't make sense. Listen to the other ones. So the first one is, we're talking about means here, sorry. In the Exodus, we see plagues. God uses all kinds of things, frogs, grasshoppers, boils, nasty stuff, just to show people who he is. The second thing is the crossing of the Red Sea. We see that in the Exodus story as well, where God opens up the sea so that his people can cross through, and immediately after they're done crossing through, he closes it back up and their enemies are swallowed. The next thing is that Moses himself acts as a means of deliverance, so God actually uses the person of Moses to deliver his people. In the Judges, she looks familiar because Andy had her, huh? We planned that, just so you know. We didn't. Deborah, we see that in Deborah in a bunch of the Judges. So God uses the world system, the systems that he has in place for his deliverance. The next thing is he uses an angel in the story of Isaac, Abraham and Isaac, the angel to stop him from killing his son. The next thing is Joseph, again, kingdom in power, a person. He delivers his people from famine. The next thing is the burning bush. Signs and wonders God uses a lot. So burning bush in Exodus. There's also the pillars of smoke in Exodus, pillars of smoke and fire that lead the people. And then the manna from heaven. Sorry, you just missed two, buddy. My bad. Manna from heaven also, again, big signs and wonders that God uses at times. Then in the book of Esther, I pulled out this story. Esther does serve as a person that God used to work through. But also I really like this story because in it, Mordecai says something along the lines of, I want you to go talk to the king. And she's like, I'm afraid. And he's like, well, if you don't do it, God's going to do it somehow. And like, I love that story because, yeah, she ultimately is the one that God uses to bring about deliverance. But if she didn't do it, he would have brought it about somehow. The next thing is the law, which brings about a standard of holy living for his people, sets them apart from the nations, and protects the people within Israel, the ones that are indebted, the ones that are slaves, the ones that are, what's the other word I got? Innocent. Ha. The next thing is in his blessings and curses. You see a lot of those in the Old Testament. Also in times of war. So we see in Joshua, this is a really cool story where he's in war and he says, God's going to deliver us. The sun stands still and hailstones rain down and all the enemies just die. Well, done. That was quick. So then two more people that I want to point out are Rahab and Ruth. Just keep going. Those are people where God uses individual people and individual people's lives to deliver them. So Rahab delivers a dude. She gets spared from death. Ruth, through her kinsman redeemer Boaz, is delivered. It's a lot of things. Why did I pull out 15 different examples from all over the Old Testament where I could have just said one? Because the point is that regardless of the means that God uses, God is always the deliverer. Regardless of what he does, what he uses, whether it's a human, an angel, a world system, a power, a sign, a wonder, the goal is so that we know who God is. So I want to go on to the goal next. So now that we've looked at what's the definition of deliverance, how does it happen, I want to look at what the goal is. And the goal ultimately is to showcase God's character. So the first big thing is that even though the Israelites are consistently rebellious, God's character doesn't change. His love and his faithfulness always wins. And the people's temporary suffering always points them to a hope of a brighter tomorrow. Their momentary, temporary things are so that God can redeem them and show himself off as the creator who redeemed Israel from the Egyptians, who will lead his people into a new exodus. So for Israel, the Lord is Savior always, present, future, and that's true today. So the second thing is, the word used in the Old Testament is for kindness, and love is actually called hesed, which you squish it together makes loving kindness. So the character of God in his loving kindness, God's special relationship with the children of Israel is what this word really gets at, that God really cares for his people. And so through these acts of deliverance, we see God's loving kindness is entirely voluntary. Becca talked about that, and Ben did a little bit about how the obedience of the people is not what motivates God. God is motivated out of his own love. And so, we even see in the Old Testament where God constantly tells his people, they're doing something really dumb, and his response is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God who delivered you from this. And that's how he defines himself, by his acts of love and mercy. The third thing is for restoration. And I bring this up because times of punishment, when Israel was delivered into the hands of their enemy, was not for the enemy. It was so that Israel would be restored to God. God's goal in delivering Israel into their hands of their enemy was always so that they would return to him. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about in regards to God's character is ultimate deliverance. Sorry, your head was in the way though. So all the acts of deliverance in the Old Testament point to a final and ultimate deliverance. All of the descriptions that we see of deliverance in the Old Testament serve as a symbolic representation of the spiritual deliverance from sin, which is only available through Christ. And as God acted in the temporal situations in the Old Testament, where we see enemies and famine and all of these things that they're temporarily worried about, Christ offers deliverance from our actual biggest fears and problems, which are sin, evil, death, and judgment. So by God's power, believers are delivered from this present age and from the power of Satan's reign. And so all of the aspects of deliverance are available only through the person and work of Jesus Christ, who was himself delivered up for us so that we would be delivered from eternal punishment. So I like looking at deliverance because you see all those stories in the Old Testament, you think, wow, those are really cool. It's really cool how God acted in that crazy way. And then we get to today, and Jesus has acted for us in the craziest way, not motivated by our behavior, not in any type of means where it could be confused with what was really going on here. God acted by himself for our sake. And so his righteousness and goodness brings his people to final salvation in the Old Testament and today, which is our final deliverance. So you have roughly until 10 minutes.